In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to work the Granny Stripe Shawl. This is a free pattern you can find on my blog, and it is a simple top-down triangle shawl that uses the granny stitch that's commonly used in blankets and in granny squares, and we're just going to use that stitch to make a shawl. So this is my shawl, the sample in the pattern, and I worked this out of a self-striping yarn. And for my sample today, I'm just going to use some solid acrylic. The sample shawl is made out of fingering weight with a smaller hook, but I'm going to be using worsted with a H hook or a 5mm hook. And the great thing about top-down triangles is you can really use any hook and any yarn because you make the size, determine the size as you go, so it's really easy to adapt. But that's what I'm going to be using for my sample in this video. So to start the shawl, we're going to start here at this point, this corner, and with a small number of stitches, and we're going to be working back and forth in rows, doing increases at 1, 2, 3 points to grow our work outward. So I have my hook, I have my yarn, I have my pattern, and to set up the pattern, we have to chain 2. So I'm going to make my slip knot. I'm going to chain 2. And then we're going to do 5 double crochets into the second chain from hook. So yarn over, second chain from hook, 1, 2. I did my 5 double crochets. I can just tighten my tail now. And now for row 1, we are going to turn our work and we're going to chain 2. And we're going to go do 3 double crochets into that first stitch. That's 3 double crochets into our first stitch. For this pattern, our turning chain does not count as a double crochet. So we did 3 double crochets into that first stitch, and now we're going to skip one. I'm going to do 3 double crochets into our next stitch. So yarn over, skip one, 3 double crochets into this stitch. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to skip one and do 3 double crochets into our last stitch. And that's row 1 of our pattern. And we have our 3 clusters of double crochets, which gives us these 2 gaps. So each of these 3 double crochets in one stitch, that's called a cluster in the pattern. And we have 3 of those and 2 gaps. So we know we're right on track. Now for row 2, we turn our work and we chain 2. Now we're going to do 3 double crochets into the first stitch. Now we're going to do 3 double crochets into this 1 stitch gap. This is the gap here. We want to put 3 double crochets, our next cluster of stitches, in this gap. So yarn over, put my hook in that gap, and just put 3 double crochets. Now we're going to do we're at our point where we want to increase for our shawl. We want that center increase. That's going to keep our triangle shape. So we're going to put our next cluster into this stitch. And this is the middle stitch for this cluster. It's the second of the stitch of this middle cluster. So we put our hook right in there. And we put another cluster of double crochets here. And this will increase our work outward, so we maintain that triangle shape. And now we just put another cluster in this hole. And to end our row, we put 3 double crochets in the last stitch of it, which is the last stitch of the previous row's cluster. This was actually our first stitch of the other row. So we just make sure we put it right in that last stitch. We're going to put another cluster of 3 double crochets. 2, 3. And that's row 2 of our pattern. You can already see we're starting to get this triangle shape. We're now on row 3 of the pattern, and this is the row we're going to repeat until our shawl. For the rest of the shawl, we're going to repeat row 3 for the rest of the shawl, and this is the row that we're going to repeat. We're going to chain 2, 3 double crochets in the first stitch, and we're just going to put 3 double crochets into the gaps until the middle cluster. So we're going to put a cluster of double crochets in all the gaps we see until we get to this middle cluster, and it's really easy to see because it's the one that it's the peak of our shawl. And when we get here, we're going to put 3 double crochets in that middle stitch again. So let's work there. We're just going to put a simple granny cluster right in these nice easy gaps. Put our cluster of 3 double crochets, and now we're at the point where we have to increase, so we just put our next cluster in that middle stitch. You can see here's the first one, the last one, that middle one. This stitch is where we want to put our next cluster of double crochets. So 1, 2, 3, and now we just work in all the holes until we get to the last stitch. And the last one, we're just going to put our next cluster into the last stitch of the row. So 1, 2, 3, the third one of this cluster. We just put 3 more double crochets. And that completes our row. And that's the row we're going to repeat until our shawl is the desired length. You're just going to increase at the first stitch, in the middle stitch, and the last stitch by putting a new double crochet cluster into those stitches. And the rest of the time, it's just like working a granny square. And that's how to work the crocheted granny stripe shawl.